The forest wore winter like a memory that refused to fade. Snow rested in the crooks of birch and pine, pressed into drifts along the creek, worked into a thin crust that cracked under anything heavier than a thought. The air was brittle enough to ring if struck. Nothing moved that didn't mean it. In that kingdom of careful silence, a lynx stepped out of the underbrush and became the only thing the world seemed designed to notice. She was not large, but she was all tendon and purpose. Frost dusted the tips of her ear tufts. Her whiskers had a few white hairs threaded through them, the kind that come from learning more winters than luck alone can explain. She placed each wide paw on the snow as if the forest floor might be sleeping, and she respected that. The pad spread, the weight held, the crust did not break. She listened. The stillness in her listening was a kind of language. Somewhere down in the spruce bottoms, a grouse shuffled, shouldering aside snow to find what it could. Somewhere up in the wind, crows traded insults. Closer, nothing. The lynx stood motionless until the steam from her breath became invisible, until her own heartbeat seemed too loud, and then she shifted. Hunger pushed from behind, experience pulled from ahead. She moved. The old pine grew where the slope met the flats, a survivor too gnarled to be vertical anymore. Lightning had knocked its crown years ago. Storms had split it. Beetles had tried what beetles do. But the trunk lived, spiraled with scar and resin, its lower limbs bowed and thick, strong enough to hold a deer's weight if a deer had reason to climb. The lynx knew the tree the way you know a threshold you've crossed 100 times. When snow was high and scent traveled poorly along the ground, that pine became a tower. She set claws to bark and went up with the quiet that made owls jealous. Halfway to the broken fork, she stopped, body flattening against the trunk, ears pivoting. A sound she did not expect slid across the wind, a low diesel murmur, intermittent and patient. The kind of machine that doesn't hurry because it doesn't need to. She breathed in and tasted what the noise dragged behind it. Exhaust, oil, hot metal, and human wool gone sour with work. Farther off came the hollow thud of something wooden against something harder. She climbed higher. From the fork she could see the river, a dark seam where ice failed to stitch two halves of the valley together. Beyond that, a narrow road unwound from the trees like a ribbon tied to a mistake. Two figures moved along its shoulder, one taller, one narrow in the shoulders, and awkward in the knees, and a sled behind them carrying a row of wooden boxes with slotted fronts and wire mesh lids. The taller figure wore a hat pulled down hard. The shorter one kept lifting a mitten to pinch a scarf tighter across a small face. The lynx knew the boxes. The forest knew the boxes. Steel teeth hid in kindling and meat. Some mouths closed without chewing. The taller human knelt at the edge of a spruce thicket, hands working the cold, stiff wire with the ease of repetition. The smaller one watched, shifting weight foot to foot, breath a trembling cloud. The lynx watched, head low, eyes narrowed to slits that still saw more than most eyes open wide. Her tail tip ticked once, twice. She could hunt now or learn now. Winter does not forgive those who choose wrong. Below, a hare stepped out of a tunnel in the snow, ears half folded against the cold, the world in its eyes simple and immediate. The lynx felt her muscles draw into a single thought, jump, but she did not. She held. The hare moved away from the trapline and the men and vanished into the alder shadows. The lesson stayed. The wind shifted. With it came another smell that did not belong to machines or men. Blood iron gone old, hair burned where it should not have been, fear thrown into air by something that had not yet decided whether it would die today. The lynx blinked and found the thread of it as surely as if it were visible. It ran parallel to the human track for a time, and then veered down toward the river's bend. She lowered herself along the branch until the pads of her paws gripped bark, and then slipped backward down the trunk, claws zipping soft furrows into the pine. At the base, she paused long enough that a clump of snow fell from a high limb and struck the ground beside her without making her flinch. She moved away from the old pine at an angle that kept her in the ribboned shadows, out of the open. Her ears kept some of their attention on the men and some on the river, and in that split she felt the old tension of winter work. All dangers close, all needs immediate. A jay scolded, she ignored it. A squirrel scolded louder, she let it live because hunger is a ledger, and panic spends more than it earns. When she reached the first sweep of the river bend, she found tracks punched into crust and frozen before they could soften. Hooves sliding, a stagger, a fall, a drag mark ending in churned snow, and the brown stamp where a body had wrestled with being a body. At the edge of the ice, an opening yawned where running water had eaten upward. Along the rim of that hole, hair. Along the hair, the smell of wolf. The lynx lowered her head and breathed until the picture sharpened. A young deer had tried the ice because the banks were crueler than the current. Wolves had tested, pressured, succeeded, only to lose their prize to the river's mouth when the ice gave. Not far off, a smear on the snow marked where a rib had caught and torn free. She found it with the certainty of a compass. It was stripped of most of what mattered, but there was grease between the bone and the frozen air, and grease is a kind of mercy when fat has become a rumor. She ate what could be eaten in the time she could spare. A raven landed, thick-shouldered and sure of its right to be near. It hopped twice, offered a coarse croak that sounded like a bargain. The lynx tolerated the company long enough to take what the moment gave. When the raven leaned too near, she raised one paw without striking. The bird understood and stepped back a single pace. The forest has many languages, most of them without sound. The machine noise swelled again, nearer now, then cut. Voices. The taller one's tone flat with instruction. The smaller one's higher, thin with cold or doubt. The lynx lifted her head and tasted the wind. It told her the men had left a loop of their intention around this place and tugged it tight. She placed her paw where a trap might be just to feel the possibility and stepped somewhere else instead. You learn the shape of pain without having to wear it. She followed the narrow line of trees that clung to the river like survivors clinging to a lifeboat. At a bend where flood had bitten into the bank years ago and left the roots of pines exposed, she saw a shape at the very edge of ice. A wildcat, smaller than herself, tail short, jacket ragged, one paw stiff with something bright around the ankle. The cat's breath came fast. Its eyes were wide and glassy, with a calculation that had too few outcomes. Bobcat pushed north by a thin year, pulled east by hunger, trapped by a loop that had been set for someone with hooves, or someone who didn't deserve to wake. The lynx anchored herself against a tree and watched. She had no pact with strangers. She had her own hunger, her own ledger. But the loop's light catching the weak sun made her ears flatten, not with anger, not exactly, but with a refusal to accept this rearrangement of what winter should be. A branch snapped behind her. The men had chosen the same bend for their next work. The taller one saw the bobcat and his mouth made a shape that meant money. The smaller one saw it and his mouth made a line that meant not breathing enough. The taller one raised a hand, and even the river seemed to hold a little stillness in its constant conversation with the ice. The lynx stepped backward into the root shadow and became bark and shadow and the idea of her. From that concealment, she watched the lesson arrive. How a hand reaches for a suffering thing, not to close the suffering, but to claim it. How a smaller hand shakes and cannot decide what it will be. How winter tightens everything until choices sound like branches in a wind that has forgotten direction. The taller one worked the pole toward the loop, a practiced slip and press to pin the bobcat's head and give the ankle slack. The bobcat spat and went rigid and then limp in the way that animals learn when struggling only pays the trap again. The smaller one looked away. The taller one looked satisfied. When the loop came off, the pole did not rise. The taller one glanced back toward the sled. An empty crate waited. The river offered no argument. From her darkness, the lynx let her breath go slowly. She measured the space, the angles, the distance between the heavy boots and the shallow ice, the moment between a hand closing a crate and a foot searching for balance. She did not move. Not yet. Hunger and justice tugged the same muscle. Caution held it. High above, the old pine took a new gust and shuddered. Snow fell from a limb and powdered the slope to the river like ash. For a long heartbeat, the wind dropped to almost nothing, then came back confused, turning in small circles, as if it could not remember where mountains ended and valley began, where the cold came from, where it should next go. The lynx watched the men watch the cat watch the river. The forest felt like a question. When she finally slid one paw forward, the motion was so slow that what changed first was not the muscle, but the idea that she might move at all. She placed her weight where the crust would hold. She kept her shoulder within the line of a root's shadow, and she put her eyes where they would not shine. In that measured inching, in that refusal to accept the arrangement offered, Something old in the valley woke up. By the time the men sensed the shift and lifted their heads, the lynx had already vanished into the bank's torn ribs. A new position taken, a new calculation made. The river sighed. The raven on the rib hopped once and said nothing. The wind turned again and seemed to ask permission. The day had only begun, but already it had chosen the kind of story it would be. The lynx moved away from the river before the men could read the air well enough to notice what watched them. She angled upslope where snow softened into drifts, protected from the harsh glare of day. The cub. No cub, she was past that. Her body small, but her instincts not yet fully sharpened, followed with a limp, hidden badly behind stubbornness. Her right paw left deeper prints, the pads bruised from where she had stepped near the trap earlier. Pain left marks longer than tracks. Sunlight fractured through branches like broken glass. The world insisted on brightness, but winter refused to show mercy. Hunger rode every breath the lynx took. Her bones remembered deeper winters, when she had shared hillsides with more lynx, when the forest's ledger had more credit than debt. Now she scented wolf where deer once slept, and rust where water should run clear. Too many changes for one season. She paused near a wind-fallen tree, its roots torn from earth, exposing secrets usually kept underground. Grub tunnels, splintered stones, thin ice sealing a pool where leaves drowned last fall. She heard the soft hum beneath the frozen crust, vole tunnels in the snow, tiny bodies living on hope and habit. She crouched, weight low, tail still. Patience almost made her forget the sting in her paw. She waited for the shift of cold fur below. Then something else moved. Not vole, not nervous hunger. A trembling branch in the lower thicket, breath too heavy for prey. She lifted her head, ears tilting toward the sound. A wolf emerged, ribs showing through winter coat, muzzle darkened with old blood. Not pack. Alone. That made him dangerous in a different way. Hunger pushed him toward risks no pack wolf would bother with. His eyes fixed on the lynx, and for a heartbeat, neither acknowledged the other as threat or competition. The wolf shifted to look past her, to the younger cat hiding behind her legs. The snow between predator and meal seemed to narrow instantly. The lynx didn't show her teeth. She didn't need to. She slid one paw back, blocking the smaller lynx completely. Her body formed a question the wolf had to answer. How badly do you need what I will not surrender? The wolf's breath steamed. His tail flicked low, uncertain. The lynx stepped forward, shoulders loose but claws ready. In another life, both would have avoided this gamble. Wolf packs hunt deer, lynx hunt hares. Balance means less harm, and enough prey for everybody who survived the last night. But humans had taken too much. The ledger was upside down. The wolf stepped forward. The lynx's growl was so low, the snowflakes shouldered aside to hear it. The wolf hesitated, not from fear, but from memory. He knew what cats could do when cornered. He knew an injury might mean starvation. Winter's a season of hard mathematics, a crack of distant metal, trap jaws snapping shut somewhere behind. The wolf flinched in the direction of the noise. The lynx used the moment to enlarge herself, tail flaring, shoulders rising. She didn't bluff. She promised. The wolf turned away, not defeated, outbid by a fiercer need. When he vanished into the birch density, silence returned like a cautious guest. The smaller lynx exhaled a tiny sound, fear or gratitude, indistinguishable in something so young. The older one nudged her once firm, keep moving. Not kind. Necessary. They climbed higher into the ridge. The day stretched thin. Clouds gathered like thoughts that weighed too much to release. The wind began to lose its direction again, turning in circles between small clearings. Tracks of hare and fox braided with those of boot and trap. Stories twisted into a single rope that could drag any animal to the wrong end of winter. Near the ridge crest, the lynx smelled something new. Pine pitch freshly cut, sap crying from wounds and trunks, chainsaw fumes gone stale but still wrong. Humans had marked territory where even bears tread lightly. She crept toward the scent, following the way sound bent around obstacles. Snow thinned underfoot, revealing churned earth and shards of bark. And then, movement. The smaller lynx flattened, pressing into the hollow of a stump. The older one froze, eyes fixed ahead. A man walked between stumps, measuring with his gaze, tapping trees with a metal rule. He wasn't like the trappers. No cages, no guns, no laughter. He paused to write something in a small notebook. His boots were clean, his jacket unscarred. Work, not war. He stopped suddenly, sensing something. His hand drifted toward his side, not for a weapon, but for balance. His eyes scanned the tree line and passed right over the lynx cloaked in roots and stillness. For a moment, his face softened, not fearful, but tired. He spoke into the air. Forests shrinking every year. Soon nothing left to measure. No one answered. The winter wind had forgotten how to carry words where they needed to go. He walked away. The lynx waited until the sound of his steps died completely. Then she turned to the younger one and brushed her head against her shoulder, just once. Permission to stand, to continue, to survive. This ridge led toward deeper country, where the old pine families still stood untouched. But between here and there stretched a tangle of dangers invented by wolves wearing boots. The lynx moved again, leading. The smaller one followed, a shadow learning to become silence, and high above, unseen, a raven traced circles in the gray air. Watching the two spots of life cross a canvas winter had tried to paint empty. The ridge narrowed into a spine of exposed roots and broken shale. Snow clung only where the wind allowed. Everything else was slick with ice polished by storms. The lynx kept her body low, each step tested before her weight committed. The younger one copied her movements with delayed precision, sometimes placing a paw exactly where the older had, sometimes slipping just enough to learn caution from pain. Below them, the forest breathed in long, cold sighs. Mist lifted from the river valley, a pale curtain hiding the memory of machines. The lynx smelled the ghosts of gasoline still floating through the timber, thin trails of scent that crawled into the lungs like a warning. Even the trees seemed tense, limbs angled inward, needles drawn close, bark whispering against bark when the wind hesitated too long. They paused at a leveled patch of ground where forest workers had once parked their vehicles. The snow was trampled by something heavier and more intentional than animal feet. Tire tracks froze into the earth like scars. The smaller lynx approached them curiously, nose down, tail lowered. The older one stepped sideways, intercepting without touching, blocking the young nose from the smell she didn't want memorized too soon. Some dangers you avoid by not knowing too much about them. A sudden snap echoed through the woods. Wood under strain, not gunfire. The lynx crouched instinctively, scanning the slope ahead. It wasn't threat, it was collapse. A rotten ash, its roots shallow in thawing soil, tipped and fell. Snow plumed into the air, scattering across deer paths. The young lynx flinched, fur spiking, but she didn't cry out. Fear learned slowly becomes instinct, learned fast. The wind shifted again, impatient, unfocused. It brought with it a mixture of odors that shouldn't coexist. The rich musk of moose, the dryness of metal, the sterile tang of human rubber. From that blend came clarity. The moose wasn't walking free, walking, something larger than it had dragged it, against will, against nature. The lynx followed the scent line until it led to a clearing chewed into the forest's ribs. There, lying sideways on the snow, was the moose calf. Legs bound, head still. The breath had already escaped. A small frost of fear still clung to the eyes. Above it, a tripod rig had been set up, its metal legs stabbed deep into the ground. A blood bucket rested beneath the animal's belly, where gravity had finished its job. Nothing eats this way except humans. The younger lynx looked at the carcass and took one uncertain step forward. The older one barred her with a single growl. Short, final. Meat found like this is bait, whether you eat it or not. She scanned the treetops. She scanned the snow. She listened for what the moose's death had summoned. A distant engine answered. It grew louder, climbing the same service road the lynxes had crossed. Then voices. 3 again, boots crunching deliberately, not wandering. Metal clinked with readiness. The lynx's tail flicked once. Decision made. They moved. They slipped behind a fallen spruce, its trunk hollowed by beetles into a hiding place older than either of them. They pressed flat to the ground as the men arrived. The smaller lynx shivered, fur prickling under winter's weight and human threat. The men examined the moose, murmuring approval. One lifted the tripod slightly, adjusting for height. Another set a heavy coil of cable on the ground and kicked snow over it casually. The lynx recognized the shape, a snare strong enough to break a leg bone if panic met steel. "This one will bring in the cats," one man said. "Fresh kill, no bullet holes. Perfect." "And the pups?" another asked. "If they follow her, we take them too. People pay anything for wild kittens, especially lynx." The younger lynx inhaled sharply. The older one pressed her paw against the ground, urging stillness. The men laughed as if they'd said something smart. They began moving the carcass, dragging it to the tripod's center, leaving streaks of dark red that glistened like signals no animal could ignore. The smallest sound betrayed them. A twig, thin as a whisker, snapped under the younger lynx's shifting weight. All three men turned. The lynx did not breathe. The younger one froze mid-H tremor. One man took a step closer to the fallen spruce. His hand reached to pull aside a branch. Before the branch moved, a crow screamed overhead, sharp, ragged, furious. The men startled, turning toward the sudden outburst. The crow dove once and banked away, a flare of wings against the winter glare. The distraction stole the men's attention just long enough. The lynx pushed the younger one backward into the hollow. They retreated deeper into roots and dark. The men cursed at shadows. "Fox, maybe," one muttered. "Nothing big." But they kept looking longer than was comfortable. The lynxes did not blink. When the men finally left, tracking blood and money deeper into the valley, the lynx exhaled only once. The younger one looked up at her, confusion shaking through her small frame. The lynx brushed her whiskers against the younger's cheek, a quiet command. "Remember the smell of that bait. Remember the shape of those hands. Remember the trap you do not touch, even when dying." Hunger was loud, but survival had the final word. They slipped from the hollow and climbed upward again, toward older trees, older laws, and away from the kind of death that pretended to be food. The wind swirled around them, unsure which path it should follow. So it followed the lynx.